back to a new art journal video. Today I'm making this art journal page, so if you want to see how it's done, then just keep on watching. And I'm working in my large Dylusions creative journal as usual, and I'm starting by flipping through the journal to find a page that I want to work on. And since I always clean my stencils and stamps on empty pages in this journal, few pages are actually completely blank, but that is just how I want it to be. And I get a lot of inspiration from the patterns and colors that end up on the pages. And as usual, I'm starting by taping the seam to help keep the journal together and also to prevent any of my products to ruin the pages that are already finished. And I'm also adding some scrap paper behind the spread I'm working on, and this is also to protect the other pages. What inspired me on this page was the blue color, and therefore I decided to go ahead and bring out some really old pattern papers in different blue shades. I tend to never use pattern papers, but I do think they're so pretty, and for some reason I used to buy a lot of them just because I like how they look. 2 years ago though, I decided that I wouldn't buy a single sheet of 12 by 12 paper until I had used up my old stash, which probably will take me the rest of my life. So unfortunately you won't be able to get these papers anymore, but as always I will try and find some alternatives to add in the supply list in case anyone is interested. And the ones I used on my page here are from 7 Gypsies, and I just started tearing some pieces from the papers that I liked and adhered them to my spread with matte medium. And I also added matte medium all over the page to seal everything in, and then I made sure that my page was completely dry before I continued. The matte medium will give my page a non-porous surface, and it will be a bit tricky to use products like spray inks and stuff like that. But I do plan to use spray inks on here, but I will get back to how I solve this problem. But before we get to that, I'm going to add some detail and texture to the page, and for this I'm using these feather stamps from Whiff of Joy, and I'm stamping these all over the page using my Versamark ink, and I'm going to emboss them to get some texture. And since I did have some trouble with my distress powders last time I tried to use them, I wanted to give them a go again today after I got some tips on what I did wrong last time. The distress embossing powders doesn't melt like a normal powder would do, and it will give a really great texture once it's embossed. And I'm using the color pumice stone, that will give me a bit of a stone type texture. And I just pour the embossing powder all over my stamped images, and then I pour it onto a scrap piece of paper that I can fold in order to funnel the leftover back into the jar. Sometimes it can be hard to see when this powder is done melting, since it doesn't really become shiny and embossed like a normal image would do, but you can see a bit of a shift in color if you look closely. Distress powders contain some sort of release crystal that has to be rubbed off in order to give you that distressed one look, and therefore you have to shake the jar to mix all of the stuff together before you can use it. And after you have melted it, make sure that the image has cooled down before you start rubbing. This is what I did wrong last time, and I started trying to rub off the release crystals too soon, which meant that all of the powder ended up rubbing off as well. Also, don't put the stuff you rub off back into the jar, since that will just increase the number of release crystals in the mix, and you don't want that. When my embossing is done, I want to give the page some color, and I decided to use distress paints. These are great since they will react with water and can be mixed and moved and all that as long as they're wet. Once they're dry though, they are permanent, which is good for me since I'm working on a non-porous surface and I need stuff that won't rub off once they're dry. And I started using the color Bundled Sage, but it ended up being way too light and it almost didn't show. So I went back in with Evergreen Bow, which is a beautiful bluish green color with almost a hint of gray and silver. And I added this all over the page, and before the paint was dry, I went in with a damp baby wipe to smooth out the color. Once I was happy with the color and the way it all looked, I used my heat gun to dry the page to make sure that the distress paint wouldn't move and mix with any of the products I would add on top. And then I used a palette knife and my white gesso and added that all over the page. I focused mostly on the edges since that is where you can still see the original color of the journal, but I also added some around the pattern paper pieces to try and hide their edges a bit. I love using a palette knife or a keycard or something like that to add paint to a page, since it will give a nice texture that almost reminds me of an old plastered wall or cement that's falling apart, and I love that. And now to my solution to the whole spraying problem I had. Since I've added gesso to my page, I now have a porous surface again, but if I want to use the spray ink here, it would only stick to the gesso and not the areas around it, which isn't really what I want. So I'm going to use my spray inks directly onto my wet gesso. And this will enable the spray inks to mix with the gesso, and I can use my palette knife to move the colors around as I please. My first intention was to leave the right side almost as it was, and then just use this raised stencil from Tim Holtz to get some yellow onto the page. And I'm using the Prima color blooms, which ended up being a bit too wet, and with the gesso also being wet, it didn't absorb the color and the inks were just seeping in behind the stencil and completely ruining my idea for the right side of the spread. But then this is just an art journal and it doesn't really matter, so I just used some paper to wipe off the ink. And then I used the palette knife on the rest of the spread like I had planned, while I was figuring out what to do about my mistake on the right side. And I decided to just forget about the stencil and pretend that I had planned to do the same thing all over the whole page from the beginning. So I went in with some more yellow on the right side and used the palette knife to mix the colors with the gesso just like I did on the left side. Then I just keep going with this idea and added some bright red to the page as well. I wanted to have a dark orange color, but I knew that if I would spray with orange and try to mix it with the yellow, it would not turn into the color that I wanted. So I took a chance and added this bright pinkish red in the hope that it would get that perfect shade of orange. And I also added a bit of a dark purple color, hoping to get a dark orangey brown color that would match the rest of my colors. So, in other words, I completely gambled on this one since I had no idea if the colors would mix the way I was hoping for, but art journaling for me is all about just trying and finding out what happens. So I used my palette knife to drag the colors from the bottom towards the top to kind of make my own rays of sunshine. And I have to say that I did end up with the exact colors I had in my mind. And I know for some of you this may not be a surprise, judging by the colors that I started out with, but I am terrible at color theory and I tend to mess up a lot when trying to mix colors, so to finally get it right is a bit of an accomplishment for me. Since this page is now really wet due to all of the gesso and spray inks and the fact that the layer beneath it isn't absorbing the moisture, I have to dry this before I do anything else. And I knew this was going to take a while to dry, but I didn't want to end up smearing the colors, so I used my heat gun for a while and then I left it to dry on its own about an hour or so. Then when I came back to my page, I thought that it kind of had a golden thing going on, so I decided to use a product that I have had forever and actually never tried, and that's the Inca Gold. And I'm actually quite excited that I finally have a page where I feel like I could pull off some golden colors. And I'm using my fingers to add some of the gold around the edges of the page, and I also bring some of it down from the top to tie the page together better. And then I kind of got stuck and I felt like the page needed something more, but I don't know what, and I don't want to ruin the colors on the bottom of the page, so I'm very hesitant to do anything right now. But I know that I do want to add some sort of sentiment. For me, art journaling is more about the art than the journaling, and I'm not really a poetic kind of person, and I wouldn't be able to come up with any fancy quotes even if my life depended on it. And I try to find inspirational quotes on Pinterest and blogs and all that, but I don't know. Those kind of things doesn't really feel like me and I don't want to force it. So sometimes my pages don't have a sentiment or a quote, and sometimes I kind of just borrow a quote from someone else. Usually though, I end up feeling like the page needs some sort of text, like I do on this one, and I'm not going to come up with anything good myself, so why not use stamps with pre-made ones? So I decided for this page that I would go ahead and use a stamp from Tim Holtz and Stampers Anonymous, and I have to say I really like these stamps since it makes it so easy for me to add something inspirational to my pages. And after stamping the quote in black, I looked at my page and decided I needed to add some more black to make it all blend together. I decided on using a black spray ink from Dylusions, and since I now had covered large portions of my page with gesso, I was confident that the ink spray would be absorbed and stay where I wanted it. So I brought out 2 stencils from Tim Holtz and added some patterns around the page. It still wasn't really enough black though, and I wasn't going to add any more spray ink since that would have been too much, but I have always loved the effect of black ink splatter, so I brought out my black India ink and the palette knife from before to just splatter some ink around the page. I tried to concentrate the splatter on the darker portions of the page and then just fade them out towards the top in order to mimic the color balance that was already there. And that is the finished spread. Sometimes I reach a point where I like a part of my page too much to go ahead and keep working on it, even though I want to. And that was the case with this page. I wouldn't exactly say that I'm 100% happy with how the page turned out, but I like the way the colors mixed and the texture on the bottom half of the page, and I didn't want to lose that by adding more. Perhaps the page would have been amazing if I did, but in real life you can't press the undo button if you realize you made a mistake. So I guess sometimes I like to play it safe. So that was all I had for today. I hope you liked it, and if you did, please give it a thumbs up. I will be back on Thursday with a new technique video, so I hope I'll see you then. And thank you so much for watching.